Hi, I'm Kimmy with On William Street, and we are here to help you become a more confident quilter, from the piecing to the quilting and everything in between. This week, we're going to talk about fabric choices. So when you're trying to pick the fabric that you want for your project, there's kind of three different areas that I'm going to talk to you about to go over, and things to consider as you're putting together those fabric choices. So the first one that we're going to talk about is going to be value. We're going to talk about scale, and we're also going to talk about color. So I've got a bunch of different fabrics here to kind of help demonstrate the things that I'm talking about. So first off, when I'm talking about scale, I'm going to be talking about the scale of the print. We don't have a lot of huge scales, but there are a lot of designers that have very large scale prints. Tula Pink is one of them, and she's got a lot of bright, bold prints. And you can see that the print, the repeat, is a very big repeat. You've got, this is kind of more of a medium scale here, the repeats. You've also got what we call, small scales. These are very small repeats. These would fit in very small blocks, no problem, and you wouldn't lose things. So one thing to consider is the size of your blocks. If you're making a block with a lot of teeny tiny squares, you don't want a huge large scale print, because then you're going to end up with a lot of things that don't make sense. It's going to be hard to get consistently get pictures in there and the prints in there and have it make sense. So it's a lot easier if you have little tiny pieces to use small scales. Also, something to consider when you're thinking about scale is when you're putting fabrics together. If you have two fabrics and they have very similar scales, there's not going to be as much contrast there. So it's always nice to kind of mix up and do larger scales with some smaller scale blocks, especially if they're going next to each other, and especially if they are very similar in color. If you look here, these were the two I had. So I have these two prints. They're very similar in scale. They both are, a smallish, more of a smaller scale. They're also very similar in color. And you can see if I put those two together, they're going to get lost. There's not going to be a lot of definition there. So if you're looking for a lot of definition, you want to mix it up and you want to change the scale. Or if we put this now next to it with the lighter and the darker, there's a lot more definition going on, and you're going to be able to see the difference in those fabrics. So it's going to hold the shapes of those pieces a lot better. This is also the perfect segue to talk about value. So with value, the whole point of value is you want to make sure that you're having a mix of lights and darks. This is also going to add a lot of interest to the quilt. If you take things that are a lot of the same value, even across colors, and we put these together, if you were to take a black and white photo of these, it's actually all going to come out and it's going to be very, very similar shades. There's not a lot of contrast, there's not a lot of interest being created here. But if we switch some of these out for some darker prints or some lighter prints, and we go back in and we take a photo, you're going to start to see that that's going to be a huge difference in the quilt, and you're going to have those light and those dark areas, and it's going to have a lot more interest. So that's another thing you want to consider. You want to make sure that the scale varies and that the scale fits the pattern. Also, you want to look at value. Make sure that you're including light fabrics and dark fabrics. And this is displayed here even if the fabrics are the same color, they're all blues, you can still see that there's a big variance in the look. So while these two are, again, very similar, not a lot of contrast, you change that value out a little bit, still have that same blues scheme going on, but now there's a lot more contrast there. So that's one other thing that we really want to think about and consider when we are picking our fabrics. The last thing I want to talk about is color. So you can actually make a quilt with all one color. It's called the monochromatic color scheme, and they can make some very beautiful designs. But if you're doing one color, something to keep in mind is to definitely make sure that you're varying them, like we talked about. The different values are what's going to bring all that interest. And it's, like I said, it's going to help make sure that your pieces stand apart from each other so that you can see those pieces and see those shapes that you're spending time creating with the quilt. Another way to approach color is, I've got an example here. On most selvages, you're going to see these little dots. And these little dots are actually going to be reproductions of all the colors that are in the quilt. And that's a great way to kind of help bring in different colors when you're picking fabric for a project. Like down here we have green. So I've got a couple different greens here that we could bring in and use. And both of these are very similar to the green down here. And both of them would work great with this. This also shows that difference in scale. I've got this bigger, bolder one, which would probably be my main fabric. And so I've got smaller scales here to offset it. And it's going to look really well together at the end. I've also got this blue. It matches this Tilly blue down here. Again, And all three of these actually work really well together because we're pulling them all from the same color palette down here. So that is one way that you can definitely approach picking the different colors for the fabrics that you want. This one is also done in a very similar way. So this has a white background, but we can see the main colors that are in here. So you could start to pull in some purples. You could start to pull in some dark blues. You could pull in some of the different greens. These three are all very much the same value. You can see if you were to take a black and white photo, these all would probably be about the same shade. It works because this is so bright, but if I was adding more fabrics to that, I would probably try to stick with maybe some light green, not that one. Some lighter green as well. See, and actually almost you can see as you put those together, they're both too white. So these look better, but as you bring in more, vary, you know, some of the colors and the tones in that as well, so you get a nice mix and don't have them all be this color. So those are another thing that you kind of want to look at. The last way that you can approach it is to not worry about a focal print, especially if you're doing more tone on tones, and you can actually look at some of the different color schemes on the color wheel. So what I have kind of pulled here that I can create is an analogous color scheme. So what an analogous color scheme is going to be is 3 colors next to each other on the color wheel. So we know that we have blue is going to sit next to purple, which is going to be sitting next to our blue-green. So this is what I call an analogous color scheme. Again, these are all the same color. So I would make sure that I mixed in some lighter tones, put our blue back in here, and I'm also going to make sure that I have maybe some darker tones. These aren't the right color of purple, so we're going to swap both of those out. And that's more of an analysis. We have our blue purple, blue violet, blue, and then our blue green, and they're all next to each other on the color wheel. So that's another way that you can approach it, is just find those color wheel groupings. You have your complementary, you have your analogous, you have monochromatic, but then make sure as you're putting them together, you're looking at the scale and you're varying the scale in the prints, and you're looking at the tone and the shade, and you're varying the shade as well, and you have some lights, some darks, and some in the middle. So remember, when you're picking fabric and when you're making a quilt, one way to really keep the interest up is going to be to choose varying levels of things. Whenever you have something that's all the same, that's when it's going to read flat and it's not going to be as visually appealing. So remember, the things you want to watch for are scale. Make sure that you're picking patterns of different scales, and then also if you have a very large scale print, you're pairing that to a quilt pattern that's going to allow you to highlight that. Pick ones that have large blocks that can show off those prints. If you have a quilt pattern that's got a lot of little tiny print pieces, you're going to probably want to stick with a smaller scale. The other thing to remember is definitely remember your shade. Make sure that you have lights and darks. And this is incredibly important if you have a limited color palette. So if you do have a monochromatic or only have a couple colors in there, make sure that you're varying the shade so you have some lights, some mediums, and some dark fabrics. And that's going to really help with that interest and keep things moving around. It almost brings your fabric and your quilt to life. And then of course the last thing is the color. You know, you can use the little cheater sheets on the fabric themselves to pick the colors that are going to match and are going to go well and work with that together. You can also stick with the color wheel and find the different color palettes that fit on the color wheel and use those to pick your colors as well. So if you have any questions, definitely let us know. You can leave a comment or you can send us an email. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so you know whenever we make a new video. And if you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you can see all the fun things that we're working on, and we'll see you next week.